with this. Okay, so Joseph Hall imagined this. He writes a book called The Discovery of a New World. It's a satirical account of a journey to Australia, but Australia is really being used quite literally as a world turned upside down. So you can imagine this is largely a kind of social commentary on kind of vices in contemporary society, but set up in a kind as if it's a kind of travel text. Now, I'm interested in this because it's one of the places he goes to is a province called Drinkalia or Drinkalia, which is a place of intemperate drinking with the main city Carousie-Canakin. Okay, and what the description of this place, there is a feast taking place to the god here is Bacchus, and at the end of this, the master of ceremonies calls for the drinking of healths, which we've already had mentioned about, and one of these is the singing of a catch. And it tells us in quite a lot more detail than we'd normally get about the kind of processes going on. There is lots of literature that links singing and drinking, but they often don't tell us how those two are kind of fitting together. Because this is trying to be travel writing, I think it gives us a little bit more. Now, it is imaginary, but as I said, I think there is a sense here of kind of social commentary going on as well. So he writes, this past upsets another with this catch. A health to you and us this day, and so health to all Drinkalia. Seasoning his song with many a good belch, and so down upon his marrow bones, and up with the pot hand smooth, the devil a bone finds he in the drink. And after him, they must all follow, and then we get on to, after him, they must all follow, woe be to him that hangs an ass. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So the word catch here suggests a polyphonic song. So for anyone who's not a musicologist here, we're thinking rounds, we're thinking things like London's Burning, where everybody sings the same tune, but you come in at different times, and you quite naturally get something that is harmony. It's a very simple way of singing a polyphonic song. You don't need to read music. It's kind of quite all. Obviously, as you'll see, the way we know most of this today is for the few people who did write these things down. What we get here, though, is also actions that are accompanying the singing. So it talks about going down on his marrow bones, so those, I believe, his shin bones, and then up with a pot hand smooth. So we get almost a kind of mock religious ceremony going on here with kind of kneeling and raising and drinking going on. And the beginning of the song, of course, also creates an expectation that others are going to join in. There's a social pressure. That line about woe be to him that hangs an ass, that apparently means to hold back or be reluctant. Get to the OED for some of these phrases. But there's also accompanying noises. The belching is an obvious one, but later in the passage, it also talks about using knives and quart pots as vessels, basically as kind of percussive instruments to accompany song. So what this begins to do is shed light on a group of songs, particularly rounds and catches, that function as kind of action songs. They articulate communal drinking and noise-making rituals, and the song is a means, I think, of controlling what's going on here. So this paper for me stems from work on rounds and catches that I'm doing at the moment, and particularly interested in a repertoire that comes into view about kind of 1580-ish. There's just a few examples earlier on. And kind of we see the biggest collection in the publications of Thomas Ravenscroft in the early 17th century. And I take my endpoint really as kind of Clayford's early collections in the 1650s, 1651, 1652, largely because he's looking back a couple of decades as well, often looking at repertoire of the 1630s and 40s. Now, by the time we reach that point, this genre has changed quite considerably. We've gone from something that I think initially is a predominantly oral tradition into what is now the start of what's going to be regular printing of this repertoire. We've moved from largely anonymous songs to now pretty much all the songs having a composer attributed to them, sometimes erroneously. And we've also shifted socially, I think. You see this in some of the drinking things as well. We go from kind of ale drinking to wine drinking. There's a kind of shift going on. So that's the point I'm stopping at. But what we do have in this period, there's some of the things we're looking at. So we're thinking about a mixture of manuscripts and prints here. So there's about 150 of them of these anonymous ones. It's quite a consistent repertoire. We see the same songs coming up time and time again. I think it is primarily oral, though I'm going to talk about the kind of written form in which we get them. They are also really, really varied in this early period. Some of them are, we get religious ones, we get moral songs, we get bawdy songs, we get drinking songs, we get urban and rural, we get bell songs and soundscapes and some educational ones. They're a real mixed bag. They're also in lots of languages. There are Latin ones, English ones, French ones, nonsense ones, and everything from 3 to 11 parts. So some of this repertoire is extremely simple. Some is actually fairly complex. I'm only going to talk about subsets of these today. In particular, I'm going to talk about those which I'm calling action songs. And by action songs, I'm meaning songs that whose lyrics and also their musical structures in many cases both articulate and coordinate accompanying actions and regulate some kind of social activity. These songs most of the ones I'm going to talk about today sit within this kind of drinking culture. So we're imagining them mostly being performed in alehouses, later taverns as well. The actions are often around drinking and passing of cups, but there is also some other kind of noise making going on here as well, particularly around use of drinking vessels. There are a few examples of this beyond the round catch repertoire. There are a few ballads, there are a few kind of freeman songs or glees, but there are a particularly large number of rounds and catches that I think can fall in this category, and they seem to me to be particularly suited in the way they work to this kind of activity. They occur throughout the period I'm talking about. So actually some of these songs appear in the very first traces of these in the 1560s. They're still occurring in Playford. I could trace this further. I'm not going to today because I think some things are changing after that. And particularly most of the ones that I'm talking about today are thinking about quite communal rituals. Some of the later ones get more into the kind of practices of loyal helping, which Angela Shane has written about. So I'm not going to go there today, but this is something that you can trace further on as well. There are also some of the most popular songs in the repertoire. These are ones that occur in multiple prints, manuscripts. They seem to be quite widely used. And sometimes they even get referred to in literature, which again, very few of these do. So this is the one that got me interested in this. It's called Now God Be with Old Simeon. It first recorded music appears in Lance Rolls. Lance Rolls, the kind of big early manuscript collection for these songs. It appears as a catch for 3 voices. This is cute. But it's very popular. There's various places in which it appears, and it appears references to it appear in literature before Lance Rolls. So this is the earliest one. This is Alpin Fulwell's Adulandi. In it, there is one of his dialogues takes place in a tavern, and what I'm interested in is the end of it, which is really about scene setting. It's got not much to do with the preceding dialogue. Where the characters stop their conversation and turn to drinking and singing, and Pierce, the final counsellor, says, "Let thy counsel is good, wherefore let us toss the can to and fro, and with hey jolly Jenkin, I see a knave in drinking." So we've got the drinking taking place, let's toss the can, but also this phrase, the one that's highlighted in green, is the key line of this song, God Be with Old Simeon. It also appears in a very, very different kind of context in Samuel Hartnett's work here, and in the context of talking about driving out of devils and demons. And he imagines a particular devil named Lusty Jolly Jenkins, who I think is supposed to be one who's particularly been afflicting a person, Sarah here. And this Lusty Jolly Jenkins, though, is described as a master setter of catchers all round. This is my only reference so far to someone who sets catchers around. And we see that he is charged with creating these things that are to be sung by tinkers as they sit round the fire with a pot of ale between their legs, hey jolly Jenkin, and a see a neighbour drinking. And so we get this same phrase. Yeah. Then it comes up in a third place, here where we have a different version of the song. Here it's called God Be With Our Synodon. And it comes at the end of the text. It's attributed to William Elderton, though this must be a posthumous publication. So whether there were some earlier versions or whether it's kind of taken a while to get into print, I'm not sure. But this song is quite clearly the same as God Be With Old Simeon. It is slightly different though. One of the things we have is an extra line. So this must be a slightly different version, but you'll see if you stand at the bottom of the page, that same line about jolly drinking and seeing knaves in drinking is very much here. song, though, is quite interesting in what's happening, bearing in mind that this is described as a three-person song. So it starts fairly straightforwardly with describing old Simeon. He's the one who makes cans, and we get onto in the second line, Jolly Jenkins. So we've got this kind of little narrative introducing characters. Where it starts to get more interesting, I think, is where I've put the three on there, which is where we start to get, right, oddly, a little dialogue taking place. So we get to whom drink you, we get a response, so knave to you, and then we get then, hey, Jolly Jenkins, I spy a knave in drinking. So what looks to happen is someone asks the question, someone replies, and then as somebody is drinking, the next line takes place. This song then seems to invite some kind of participation. It also seems to suggest more than one thing is going on. There seems to be some kind of dialogue set in this. Should this last line be actually sung by two different singers? Now, there are other things in this repertoire that use dialogue, and one of the things that made me think this could be a dialogue is because actually it's fairly clear that people writing down this repertoire sometimes struggled when there was actual dialogue going on. So just to give you one example of this, this is another kind of old one that comes printed quite often, called The Old Dog. The way this works is that, again, it has a straightforward first line, but the second and third lines of this catch interlink. And every person who writes it down shows this in a different way. So the earliest one is the one on the left. It's from the kind of mid-century, and it just writes it through, and you have to kind of read. But that's quite unusual. Most try and give some sense of how these lock together. I think because they're not imagining a hugely musically literate audience here, so counting rests is a hard thing to do. You have to get yourself back in the right place. It's easier to know what you're following than to count your rests. So Thomas Lant on the top, he puts these kind of lines through that seem to suggest which bits are sung by which. I think you'd have to know that this is how the song works. So if you know the song, it will remind you, but it's not actually hugely clear. And if we didn't have the other versions, I think we'd be stuck. And you can see the last line is where both parts sing the same text, but they have to sing it at different pitches. Thomas Lance, I think, is the clearest as to what's going on without scoring it up. You can see he's tried to align things. So the third line at the bottom, he's kind of aligned it in the gap so you can see how it passes between 2 and 3 and when they come back together again. Now, in these examples, they have to be quite careful to show the dialogue because there's nothing else in this text to hint that a dialogue's going on. Of course, in the one I'm looking at, the text gives you a clue. Now, I wasn't really sure whether I was heading in the right direction until I came across this catch. Now, this is a bit later. It's from the Place of 1652 collection. And this does just what that other song does at a later point. And you can see this one comes with a description that tells us what is going on. So this, you'll see at the top, says it is a 3-voice catch. But if you read the description at the bottom, it's clear that it's going to be sung with 4 voices. And yeah, so this is where the lines play in. And again, it starts, come and join me in this song, and then we'll sing this catch. So it doesn't really, it's not used content words, but in the second line, we get a dialogue. So the first person asks, but the third part comes in, what shall I do then? And somebody else sings to reply, take thy liquor off and begin again. And the instruction tells us that the 4th voice comes in at that point, take thy liquor off and begin again, and so round. So here we have that final line as a dialogue, but here we know that it was designed to be sung with an extra voice coming in. So I think what happens is that the third part sings the first, you get first per singer, sing through to the third part sings in, what do I do then a 4th person is going to have to join the song at that point. So the 4th singer in joins actually at the end, who tells them to drink, then they drink, and then they're going to follow back in. And the next thing that line 3 will do is they will drink and then sing that final take thy liquor off before they start again. So what we have is a kind of way of joining people into the singing process as it comes across. But we also have a way of controlling how much is being drunk. How much you're supposed to drink is being measured here by the pacing of this song, by the gap you've got, because you've got to come in again. And so that kind of measures out a very kind of, it's a good way of measuring an equal part, making sure everyone is drinking their share as you go round. Established that you can do this though, you start to wonder about some of the other ones that are here. So this is another one from Ravenscroft. This is a bit peculiar because it says it's for 10 or 11 voices. The 11th voice, I have highlighted in orange, all it does is rest. which makes you then suspicious as to what is going on. Now, this one doesn't mention drink, but its general tone is very in keeping with the kinds of ideas of the ale house, which this idea of kind of, spending liberally and keeping going even when you've not got very much and being merry nonetheless is very much in keeping with what this song is about. So my suggestion here too is that probably what's going on in the gap is going to be drinking, but definitely some action that is not singing is suggested in this gap. And of course, the fact that there isn't explicit drinking going on here then begins to raise questions about kind of where else is this taking place in this repertoire. There are other songs where drinking is definitely taking place, but it's not built into the structure in these ways. So this one is a really short catch, it's very simple. But again, it calls on people to kiss the cup and drink your part, but it's not within the bounds of the song. You have to do it outside of it. This one, I wonder, though, whether it's just short enough that actually it's the whole thingy of the round that gives you the space to drink before you join it. So you sing this to people, and as they come in, they drink and then join the this one's actually quite a short break. And I could talk about lots of these. There is one of the very early catches that survives from the 1560s is called "Troll the Bowl and Drink to Me." And again, that one's a very short one. I think it could function a bit like this, it's even shorter, in fact, in terms of the phrase length. There's another one called that has two names, and this again reminds us that we might not always see these apparently in our text. So there's one that's more widely known as "Joy in the Gates of Jerusalem," and it's just one line of text that's entirely reading. So you see, it's one of these kind of short, simple ones. Seems to be kind of vaguely religious on the surface of it, but it does also survive with another text in manuscript only, which is "Let us all be merry together and toss the black bowl." And so we can kind of get this sense that drinking songs could be taking place in a range of ways, and it could be that "Joy in the Gates of Jerusalem" was just as much about the drinking song as the drinking text. And we've already seen in that opening example how there's play in alehouse culture between kind of religious ritual and alehouse ritual, and we're going to see some more examples of that in a minute. And so again, it just begs the question: are these more examples of it? You can't really determine this either way, but I think it certainly makes me a bit suspicious. So there are other ways in which I think that action is going on. It's not just about drinking, it can also be about noise making. And again, there's kind of one particular catch that's got me into thinking this, and then you begin to wonder about some of the others. So this catch is called "Let's Have a Peal for John Cook's Soul." And initially we seem to be in that world of kind of bells and evoking that pre-Reformation tradition of ringing a death knell for the soul of the departed. But if you look down to about kind of phrase 2 here, you see that in fact it's not bells at all. This is about drinking vessels and the different shapes and materials that they sound. So a crude is a small clay drinking vessel. A black bowl was quite tar-coated and leather and pretty larger. Tankards were at least traditionally made of wooden staves and hoops. Cans a bit more difficult because it was used in a whole range of senses. This one, though, being a treble bell, I wonder whether it's supposed to apply something more metallic. And what they're asked to do at the end is ring merrily and well until all this ale is gone. So I think what I imagine taking place here, and what this song is kind of encouraging people to do, is to kind of ring all these different cups together while somebody is drinking, and this is going to be this act of remembrance. It's an alehouse ritual of remembrance here, and I think very much playing on the kind of sacred side as well. Now, this is the only one that's explicit, but again, there are quite a lot of songs in this repertoire that are about bells, and then you begin to wonder how many of them are really about bells. So there is another version of "Let's Have a Peal for John Cook's Soul" that doesn't have the explanatory version about what the bells are. This one can be sung with 4 or 8 voices. It's 8 in Ravenscroft, it's 4 elsewhere. But you could definitely do that peal in the same way. Then you get ones like "All into Service," which on the face of it, you're going, oh, is this a religious service? How's this happening? But in light of some of these other ones, you begin to wonder, is this again thinking about the alehouse gathering as like a gathering of a congregation? Is this service really not a real service at all? It's the service of a kind of alehouse community. And again, we get ones that seem to reference actual bells, but again, is this being recreated? The Oseley bells, is the sound of the Oseley bells being recreated in other ways too? Certainly the language in the middle, where we're thinking about kind of words that seem to imitate sonic effects, jing and ring and jing, you know, it's the noise that's important here. So what else might be going on in some of these less dictated versions, but perhaps part of the same tradition? The other thing that seems to happen, though, is that there are actions that associate with this. So that one was just kind of clattering, but there are other songs in which perhaps more kind of sophisticated actions are going on with these cans and drinking vessels. So on the left is, again, I came at this through rounds and catches, but I think this is probably broader as well, where the very last line that kind of starts 3 lines up it seems to be almost like a self-contained little song. I wonder if it's a quotation. I haven't found it elsewhere, but it feels like there when you get there. It feels like you've got to another song that joins along. It goes tap the cannikin, toss the cannikin, troll the cannikin, turn the cannikin. So lots of actions. Lots of them are going to make noise. I mean, tapping it and tossing it and, rolling it. These are things that are going to make noise. So that seems to me to be part of this process as well. And actually, there are some other kinds of songs that do this. The famous one is Iago's song from Othello, which again has kind of idea of doing things with drinking vessels and clinking them. This is not a catch, as far as I can tell, but you can get that sense of this is a process that's going on in the air. So again, the question is what is the scope of these action song catches? How far does this go? And one of the things that I find challenging, and I'd be interested to think about your thoughts on this as well, is where is the line between something telling you to do an action and something describing something that, a situation? And this is the tricky one. So this is one that I think shows the difficulty of kind of working out where each side of the line goes. So this starts, like many of the others that I've been talking about, with a kind of what seems to be a set of detecting actions. This chirping glass that no fellow pass, but take it and shake it and never forsake it for thee. And then we start getting into a commentary, though, on the drinking that's taking place. I do think thou take thy drink. What man already do you begin to shrink, but stand this about and drink it out. So we can kind of see there's already in the text a kind of narrative of what's happening in this drinking bout, that he is not going to manage to drink it. And we get a lassie slain. Give him a cup of rich canary, it will make him rise again. 'Tis vain, ding dong bell, thus we ring his knell. By force of old canary he fell, and so bade farewell. And so this one starts like it's kind of something you would follow along to, like the others, but ends up actually kind of describing a scene and describing a situation more instead. So this is the problem we have, and slightly in terms of working out what was going on in the background. Of course, people didn't really need to write these down. These were kind of things you'd know and you might have seen. And so sometimes, so I think there's a difficult boundary to tread in terms of working out which specifically are action songs and which aren't. This is one I would probably put on the probably not category, but you might have been able to do stuff to it. I mean, it's got all the ingredients of the things we've been talking about, the drinking and the ringing here as well too. So what's the purpose of these songs then, to bring them all together? Why are we doing this? Well, one of the things that comes up in all the literary references to catching, which is broadly speaking where I'm finding out the kind of broader social context of these songs at the moment. There are occasional references in other kind of historical documents, but finding them is a needle in a haystack job. So I am gradually finding them, but mostly at the moment I'm still in the literary side. This one comes just after our period, and it's from the jest book repertoire, which has quite a lot of these kind of references to catching, partly because of, I think, the social class of the character it's talking about. And in this one, Meritron the Foon is the kind of lovable rogue figure, has been travelling. He ends up in an alehouse where he finds a company of both sexes merrily trolling the bowl about, singing catches, smoking tobacco. No sooner as I entered, but one of them drank to me a full cup. I sat down amongst them, being all alike, free citizens of the wide world. And I think this encaptures what I see in quite a lot of these small encounters of catches in literature, which is this sense of community, that there is both a community existing, but also it's a way of strangers being welcomed into a space. Notice also too that this is a company of both sexes. There's quite a often an assumption this is largely masculine catching, but I now have several of these things which suggest women are in the way. So maybe not all the time, but they are definitely not entirely excluded from this. And in this case, definitely mixing of sexes is being suggested. So an interesting one. I also think that there is very much a sense in which singing is a significant means of performing these notions of good fellowship, which Mark Helwood has written particularly about. And you can see some of the values here on the screen of this culture of good fellowship that he has brought out in his wonderful book there on the right. So having a merry disposition, spending liberally, expecting people to drink heavily, often via kind of games and rituals, which I think is probably where these songs are sitting, but also being able to maintain control of your mental and physical faculties while you do so. So drunkenness is bad, drinking a lot is good. It is predicated on kind of having a trade of working hard, that you've earned the money to do this, and also having a kind of very much live for the day, present senses mentality. And these are the kind of things that are going to make you a good companion in the alehouse. Song, I think, has an important part to play in performing this nature of good fellowship, both communally and individually. And I think it does so in a way that's quite different to some of the things that ballads do. For a start, you can see these are very different kinds of song, and the sheer length of the kind of printed ballads, their kind of descriptive text is very different from what we have in rounds and captures as a whole. They are much smaller. They are often much emptier in content. They're often about the act of doing what they're doing. Often the words are kind of neither here nor there. Often so much as the practice that is going on around them. In fact, there is even a later catch that is the catch of nothing that literally does this. It talks about the process of I was going to make a catch and I thought I'd do it about drinking, and then I thought I'd do it about singing, and then it ended up being about nothing, and that's the end. But it's actually kind of entirely what these songs do. Not very much. It's all about the doing. So I think they are a means of performing clearly this merry disposition. They are a means of doing this liberality. You are spending and sharing drink. You're also sharing, of course, the song as you do. It requires you to keep a fair amount of mental and physical capacity to be able to keep your place, to keep in time with others, to get the words out, to get the music inside. And so I think it is very much showing that although you're still partaking in the drinking culture, you are still in control of your mind and body, and therefore you can still sing. And it's obviously got that element of community and sociability as well. You're doing this with others, particularly if they often call you to join and you have to make the choice to join. And I think a bit like kind of pledging and helping, there's a kind of compulsion here. But by joining in, you show yourself to be a good fellow. But I think this is not just about the lyrics, and this is key. I think it is about both the musical content and that act of performance. These are essential here. It's not just that you sing about being a good fellow, you sing about being merry, it's that you do it. And that's the key. Yeah. So Gina Bloom has talked a lot about this concept of disciplined play in the context of the alehouse rituals, and particularly how they create the boundary between drunkenness and good fellowship and manliness. That these kind of rituals, these kind of processes are what allows you to draw that distinction. Now, she talks particularly about games, but I think song is another means of doing this. Partly because these songs are dictating particular actions, particular rituals, whether that's passing, drinking, clinking, dialogue. They're also providing, if you like, a set of rules for heavy drinking. So you can't just drink whenever you want, you can't drink how much you want, you drink in this kind of prescribed way, in the gaps, when it's your turn, a particular amount. It is a ritual and process, but it's also, I think, very much a recreational one. It is fun, it's got that kind of game element in that sense, that element of play. But it's also got the element of challenge that you would expect with a game too, the need to hold one's heart to keep pace with the drinking. What is interesting about it, I think, too, is that it is both collaborative and competitive at the same time. So you can have this competitive element, how much can you drink, how long can you keep this going? But at the same time, to keep it going, you have to work with others. So it has this kind of dual edge to it, which I think is rather interesting. And yet also this kind of compulsion. Once you've, firstly, I think there's an expectation that you will join, but once you've joined, there's a compulsion to keep it going, because if you don't rejoin it, nobody else does. You've caused the whole thing to fall apart. You can't step back without causing everybody else to stop as well. So that kind of pressure and obligation, I think, is probably the slightly darker side of it. So why catches specifically? I mean, why not any song? Why not any other kind of activity? What is it that singing catch around might provide that, or might provide more than other perhaps kinds of activities? Well, the first thing I think is that kind of order. Because these are short, we've got these regular phrases that go round about. We get this sense of a musical order that I think then gives you a sense of physical order to go with it. We get fixed units of time. We get a sense of pacing. We get this element of needing to demonstrate physical and mental skill. I've mentioned that already. The other thing that really strikes me is what the effect of this circularity and repetition does. And I have to say, I'm only just dipping my toe into the waters of some of the kind of work that sociologists and psychologists are doing on this. But there is this sense of kind of repetitive and rhythmic activity is something that kind of creates an interpersonal entrainment where everybody is kind of bound up in the same activity, and that kind of repetitive and getting in sync with people has a powerful affective intensity. And I think this might be why these sit in this period and why they sit in this context and what they're doing, that it's not just about performing a happy song, it is kind of getting carried away and getting kind of bound up into this sense, to this kind of collective, ever intensifying emotions you go round and round the couch. And that of course comes with it, with creating some of these, this as a means of strengthening bonds of community, whether they're ones with people you know or with people who you're welcoming for this evening. And, you know, there's a kind of, you know, the alehouse is a site of traveling people as well as local people. And that how they interact, I think, is something going on here as well. But that sense of creating, at least, even if it's temporarily, a kind of community and sense of belonging here. Yeah, so I think that brings me to the end. I think all I'd just say, just to wrap this up then, is to bring us to our theme today, which is to think about what this means in terms of polyphony and how we think about it. Because we're not really used to thinking about polyphony as ubiquitous. We often think about the ballads as the ubiquitous bit, and the polyphony as the bit that's sitting in our part books, our choir books, our lute books, all the rest of it. But I think when we start thinking about it as something that is ubiquitous, that there were forms that people could take place in, it begins to change not just our sense of what these soundscapes are like, but actually what music can be doing in the spaces and how it creates people together. So that's where I hope this is going. And rounded catches are only one part of this as well. There's a whole aspect around kind of three men singing and kind of glee singing as well that could be explored here. So yeah, this is partly a call to say, let's have a think about ubiquitous polyphony as well. Thank you very much.